Good morning. Thanks for joining us today. We'll just take a few minutes to let everyone trickle in and get settled with your coffee or tea. I'm happy to see some familiar faces today, lots of people I've seen in past webinars and roundtables, so thank you for joining NPRN again. For those of you who maybe don't know me already, my name is Alana Powell. I'm a community manager for the Nonprofit Resource Network, along with my colleague Miley Schoonover. Before we get started with this webinar, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. Today's programming is being recorded, so if you feel more comfortable keeping your camera off, feel free to do so, but breakout room discussions will not be recorded. And then as well, just please keep sure to stay muted when you are not contributing to the discussion to eliminate any background noise. And then I'd like to briefly plug some of the next upcoming NPRN events. We have this Thursday on September 29th, an Executive Director Roundtable on the topic of personnel and organizational culture, which will be in person. And then on October 11th, another sector-wide webinar like this one this morning. This will be on the Grant Center, Ask Me Anything style with the right team. And then lastly, we have Partnership for Excellence, Activating Equity in the Central Coast. That will be held on October 19th. And then I would just like to give some gratitudes for our incredible speaker, Tarek Azzam, with the UCSB Center for Evaluation and Assessment. He is also a professor at the Gewurz Graduate School of Education. We are so grateful to have him joining us today. So really excited to kick off that programming. But before that, one last thing, we're going to hear a few words from Gary Clark from the Santa Barbara Foundation.
Thanks, Lana. And I too have appreciations for Tarek. I wanted to offer a little bit of context in kind of why Tarek and why he's here hosting this content for us. The Santa Barbara Foundation has actually partnered with the Center for Evaluation and Assessment for the next iteration of the State of Nonprofits in Santa Barbara County research findings. So many of you may have completed the recent Nonprofit Leader Survey. Want to appreciate you for doing that. Thank you very much. But it's really wonderful that we now have a local partner to work with on this major research project. And I just want to appreciate the center and Tarek and his leadership in the partnership. So thank you, Tarek, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I hope that it'll be an informative and fun session. Just throughout the session, I do welcome questions or comments or reactions. You're welcome to use the chat, and maybe Alana or Malia can let me know what's happening. I try and scan it as we get started. Thank you for the kind introduction too. As Gary and Alana mentioned, I've been involved in evaluation for 22 years now. And it's a weird thing to say, but I fell in love with the topic early on, and mainly because of how potentially useful it can be. I know that's not always the case, and a big part of today is going to be talking about how can you leverage the knowledge and the evaluation process to really help understand impacts that you're having, look at implementation, and also communicate to a broader audience regarding the efforts and the work that you're doing. And so that's going to be a big focus for today as we talk about. The way I usually like to start these types of sessions, and again, I'm trying to cram a lot of stuff into a short period of time, but I always like to start off with an activity. And this is an activity we're going to do in breakout rooms in a second. And it's really meant to help us think through some of the issues. Now, it may seem, I don't want to say it's an odd activity, but it's an activity that I'm going to come back to over and over again throughout today's session, if that sounds okay. So I'm going to introduce the activity right now and just share my screen. So give me 1 second. Okay, so yeah. So the activity is you're going to be assigned into breakout rooms, and the breakout rooms on the top left-hand corner have a number associated with them, okay? And we're going to have maybe about 10 breakout rooms. And within those breakout rooms, I want you to take note of the following, and we'll put this also in the chat as a reference. So the number of the breakout room determines the role that you're going to be playing in this particular case. So I'm going to just put this in the chat. If you want to copy it, that'd be great. So that way you have it. And so again, the number is going to be on the top left-hand corner, or maybe right-hand corner. It'll be up there somewhere. The point here is I want you to conduct a small evaluation. And the idea here is that you're going to take this perspective, whether it's a student, a teacher, an IT professional, a user experience designer, or a physical disability advocate. So if your room number says 1, you're a student. If it says 7, you're a teacher, and so on and so forth. And then within your group, I want you to discuss the effectiveness of Zoom, but from the role that you're playing or that you're part of, okay? And then at the end, and you have only 10 minutes, at the end, I want your group to come to a decision. Is Zoom good or is Zoom bad, okay? And I don't want to hear it depends. I want a decision, okay? I know this is in really absolute terms, but at least I want you to come to that decision. And you have only 10 minutes to do this, and we will keep a timer on this, okay? So before we open up all the breakout rooms, are there any questions about the activity? I have to put up the chat because I can't see them. I guess no, there is. Okay, is everyone ready? Are we good? Okay, then let's do it. Let's open up the breakout rooms and then just join. And then please remember what number is assigned to what role. Okay.
I'm opening them up now, and let me know if you have any technical difficulties. We can help you out.
It's bad, okay? So it started off as bad. And then as you started to talk about the potential things that Zoom could provide, so you'd mentioned access, you mentioned, can you tell me a little bit more about this threshold idea?
Yeah, that was me just saying because I do like work with youth, and they seem to have a Zoom threshold, and not everybody's is the same. It's like they can learn that way, they can interact that way, and then at some point it's just like it's too much, and the next Zoom they do, they're going to completely zone out. Gotcha.
So in essence, Zoom works up to a point.
Yeah.
Okay, so, okay, that's good to know. Okay, so it ended up being good. I want to hear, are there any additional insights from group 6 on what did you decide? This is, again, the student perspective.
We had a whole list of pros and cons, and maybe Jared can put those into the chat for everyone. But one of the things we thought about was the age of the students really will impact whether or not it's a positive experience for them. So for older students, college students and grad students, seems to have the benefits tend to outweigh the drawbacks. But for younger students, a lot of the drawbacks, being distracted, not being used to that much screen time, some of the things Mel mentioned in terms of like max capacity, excuse me, those would maybe outweigh some of the positives, right? Some of the things that you need about like connection across multiple geographic areas don't apply to the younger students. So we for us, whether it was a pro or con, kind of depended on the age of the students.
Okay, and what was your final decision? And thank you, Jared, for posting that. What was your final decision?
We definitely, it was yes for college and above and no for
okay, so it depends.
It was a mix.
Okay, that's fine.
Decision.
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you. Okay, let's hear from the teachers. We had groups 2 and 7. Let's hear from group 7. Who is group 7 in the teachers? What was Zoom good or bad, effective, not effective, and why? Is there anyone from 7? Okay, we'll switch to 2 then. From group 2.
I'll go. So I think we had a couple people who are teachers or have done teaching on Zoom. And so I think our perspective in general was that it was not good for teachers. Basically, just talking about how it changed the focus for teaching, like the focus of the education in general. It required that teachers had to adjust how they checked for understanding. There was lack of support for teachers. Being able to adapt a curriculum to go online was difficult. Just kind of talking about the pandemic in general, but that these are all challenges. Technological difficulties, including one of our breakout room members who could not get their video to be right set up. Oh, he's got it now. And then the challenges, we talked about how accessibility is a good thing in that you could video like be on Zoom in multiple locations, so being able to actually access, but accessibility being difficult when it comes to students with disabilities or other challenges, especially with technological difficulties. And so we did also talk about how it is really helpful in some ways, but for the most part, I think we did kind of as a group discuss that it was bad for teachers.
Okay, thank you. Those are great criteria and things to also reflect on as it relates to teachers. So we have yay for students, nay for teachers. So let's hear from, I think was it the IT? Let's see, a group, sorry. Yes, it was IT professional. Let's hear from group 8. Anyone from group 8?
I believe we only went up to 6 or 7 groups.
Oh, okay, that sounds good. Then let's hear from group 3 then.
I was in group 3.
I guess you can go, Denise.
Yeah, go ahead, Denise.
And our consensus was that Zoom was good because of the convenience of being able to meet under circumstances that you might not be able to meet. And that it wasn't that hard to use. So we thought it was good. I don't know if you want to add, if you have anything else you want to add too.
Sure. We talked about how IT professionals prefer technology to begin with. We talked about how it's not personable, but for the IT professional, most of them really don't work with a lot of people, like that whole emotional attachment type thing. So we agreed that Zoom is perfect for that type of group because they're tech savvy. It's easy for them to use because they know how to use all the technology. They can connect anywhere and be at different places at the same time. And some of the negatives were that if there's a connection issue, they have more work having to connect. They also have to set up the meetings and make sure that the connection is okay. If there's any computer problems, they have to fix them. So in a sense, yes, they get more work, which is it could be a good thing, or it could be a bad thing if they don't like to work that much. So, I mean, it just, for us, we did choose yes on Zoom for the IT professional.
That's great. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Thank you again for laying out the reasons for why that's the case. Let's hear from UX designer, user experience. Let's go with group 4.
And I don't remember the number of our group, but we were the UX designer group. I don't know if there was one of us or 2 of us, 2 groups, I mean.
There's only group 4. There wasn't a group 9, so go ahead, Colin.
Okay. So we had a good discussion, and Shakira did great notes that she shared with everybody, where the general consensus was, wow, this is a good tool, and it's enabled people to connect, and you can do things in this with this tool that are like being in a live presentation, like sharing information. So good was the general suggestion. But then stepping into perspectives of people in different categories, like a blind person or someone who is not an English speaker, or our seniors who weren't so technologically trained, so that they might be invited to Zoom events, but it's hard for them to join. And then there was a little more conversation about webinars being a bit more complex, that there's room to improve the smoothness for users in terms of participating in webinars, so that general meetings doing pretty good, but there's room for improvement. So that was a kind of quick synopsis of that discussion. Good discussion with the team.
No, that sounds great, and I really like how you looked at it overall, and then took the perspective of different participants, and from a UX perspective, levels of access and accessibility varied depending on the characteristics that you bring to the Zoom meeting, for example. And so, but the overall consensus was it was a positive thing. It was a yes. It was good, right?
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
excellent. Thank you. Let's hear the last one is a physical disability advocate, group number 5.
That would be us. We came up with a slightly tilted up thumb for thumbs up, meaning Zoom is good. We acknowledge that we didn't have anybody with a physical disability in our breakout group, so it was important to note that that voice was not actually in the conversation. We did have a participant whose mother had a physical disability and benefited quite greatly from not having to travel to a doctor's appointment. But if you would have asked our group probably 2 years ago about Zoom, we probably would have been a thumbs down, because over the last year or two, Zoom has added quite a bit of accessibility features, including closed caption. So yeah, overall, it's a thumbs up, but it's still lots and lots of room for improvement.
That's great. And thank you all. And I apologize for how fast this activity was. It's just meant to, what I was trying to make the point using this activity, I'm going to come back to it, is that when we think about evaluating something, we have to really consider who the audience is. If you notice, there was at least the students said overall it was good. The teachers said it was bad. The IT, disability, and UX providers all said that it was good. But there was one common criteria that was relatively positive, which was it allowed access across the board. That's one of the big criteria that emerged regardless of what the group was. And when we do evaluations, a big part of it is we have to ask ourselves, well, who's the user for this? What are we evaluating it from? What perspective or perspectives that we're engaging in to really help us focus on what criteria we're going to look at. Part of this process also involves this idea of this is kind of the discussion / lecture side of this. And as I'm talking, please raise your hand, or you're welcome to add in the chat, and I'll try and respond to it as best as that I can. So within evaluation, there's this idea called the logic of evaluation. And what I was trying to simulate was how it can change depending on who this evaluation is conducted for or who's involved in it. So the logic of evaluation is basically a 4-step process. The first step is we set out the criteria. We say Zoom should be accessible. Okay, so that's the first criteria that we may have. The second step of this process is, well, what do we mean by accessible? How accessible should it be? Should it be accessible to everyone across all ages? Should it be accessible for those that are in college or those in an elementary school? Like, what do we mean by accessible? Okay, so what you're doing is you're setting the criteria, and then you're saying, here's when we consider it to be good, and here's when we consider it to be bad. And so, and again, I appreciate Gary's comments that it's kind of good. So it was accessible because of the closed captioning, the ease of access to it, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the broad spectrum of potential physical disabilities, it might not necessarily be considered good. It might not perform well on that. And that's what's meant by setting the standard. We have a criteria, accessibility, but what do we mean by accessibility? And that can vary depending on who you focus on. Let's extend this out to different programs. So you have programs that address homelessness. You have programs that focus on educational outcomes. You have programs that focus on equity. And so within those programs, you'll have a list of criteria on what's considered, what they should focus on. But the second part of that list is, how do you know that you're going in the right direction or not? That's what's meant by the standards of performance. And then the last two steps is when you're actually collecting data. And so the idea there is that we set the criteria, we set what's considered good or bad based on that performance. And now we have to actually collect data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, survey, GPA, outcomes, number of homeless individuals before and after, and so on and so forth. And that helps us understand, did we do well on this criteria or did we not do so well on this criteria for each single one of them? And then the last step of this process is combining everything together. And here's kind of what's kind of tricky about it from an evaluation perspective. And I'm going to say something that may sound controversial, but not all criteria are equally important. And so part of the job of the evaluator of programs is to reflect on what are the most critical criteria. The best example I can give you is like if you're evaluating a car, you can say, okay, a car's criteria that has to have good mileage or I was going to say gas mileage, but now it's like range. You know, we're in the electric vehicle world now. So it has to have good range. It has to go 300 miles on a single charge. It has to seat, if it seats 4 or more people, that's really great. A lot of trunk space and so on and so forth. Okay, so those are all nice to have criteria for evaluating a car. However, there's maybe one last criteria, which is safety. Let's just say that, you bump it in the back and it explodes. Okay, it just fails on that one single criteria. It does everything else really, really well. Amazing range, seats 20 people, it's super comfortable, but it just has this little thing where if you just happen to bump it, it just explodes. And so that criteria, it becomes what's called a critical criteria, where regardless of how well it performs on everything else, if it fails a critical criteria, then as a product and as a program, it fails itself. Okay, so regardless of how it performs on everything else. And so part of thinking about this process is we think about, so when let's just say extrapolate it to Zoom, a potential critical criteria for Zoom is that it actually opens up. I know early on when, these things started to come online, half of them didn't even open up. So you'd have a meeting schedule, you'd have to log in like 15 minutes before, because for whatever reason, it needed to update this and update that and so on and so forth. If it doesn't actually open up, then it fails as a product in that case. And that's basically what I mean when I say the logic of evaluation, where you set up criteria, you set up standards of performance, you actually measure them, and then you do some kind of synthesis at the end to make sense of it. So I'm going to come back to this, but what I'm planning on doing today is I want to introduce you to what I call like the evaluation process and provide you with at least a framework for how to assess things like impact and implementation and so on and so forth. This is a really broad overview that I hope will be helpful, but the goal here is to really at least give you some insights around how to think about and frame evaluations within your programs or other activities related to that. I'm just checking the chat real quickly. Oh, good. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, let me know again if there's any questions that come up. I'm not monitoring the chat, just to let you know, but I'm happy to. I would like to respond to them. So this is a really common framework in evaluation. It's actually developed by the CDC in the 90s, before all the chaos surrounding the CDC. But the reason why I like to use it is because it's probably the clearest and I think most realistic perspective on how to do evaluation that I've seen so far, and it's widely accepted in the field. So, and I want to just go through this process and explain some of the steps and why they're critical. Okay, so the first step in this is engaging stakeholders, and the reason why I love this framework is because it doesn't go directly into, well, we have to do an evaluation. Well, what is, what do people want to know? They want to know, impact and so on and so forth. Engaging stakeholders is really critical because every single evaluation has to have some user at the end, whether it's you as the organization, whether it's an outside entity, whether it's a combination of individuals that are associated with it. And it's often the step that's sometimes missed when you're doing evaluation. And this is weird to say as an evaluator, but you don't do evaluation for evaluation's sake. This is not research. You do evaluation for a purpose. And trying to understand what that purpose is involves talking to the stakeholders that may benefit from it, and it really helps to focus what you're going to look at. If we go back to the Zoom example that we just did as a group, notice that every different stakeholder, whether it's the student, the teacher, the disability advocate, the UX designer, they had slightly different criteria on how they evaluated Zoom. And so ensuring that you are engaging the appropriate stakeholders for the evaluation is really critical, because in essence, it helps you set the criteria in terms of what counts as important and what doesn't. It helps to facilitate future use. If there are stakeholders that are really interested in the outcomes, you ensure that the evaluation product or process kind of provides them with information that they can use at the end. That's something that's really, really important as part of this whole process. And then the second step that's involved is something called describing the program. And then when we describe the program, what we're trying to do is we are trying to be as clear and concise as possible about what we hope to accomplish and how we hope to accomplish that, okay? And the classic way of doing it in evaluation, there are a lot of other ways, but the classic way of doing it is something called the logic model. And now I'm actually really curious if people can raise their hands, like how many people have actually heard the term logic model or program theory? Okay, so I see about almost half, most, okay, good. Most people have. Okay, excellent. And so the reason why, and for those that haven't really encountered it before, a logic model is basically a systematic approach to help you reflect and share a common understanding about what the program aims to achieve and what activities it'll engage in to achieve those goals. And so here's a really quick example. This is, again, just like more of a technical definition of it. It's a graphic representation of a program showing the intended relationship between investments, activities, and results. So this is and that's meant to be humorous. So I cry, mommy and daddy appear. So the activity is a baby crying, but it leads to something, which is support, some kind of activity associated with it. Another one, it's basically divided up into the inputs, which are the things that you invest in the program, the activities, which are the things you actually do with that investment. And by investment, I mean time, money, staff. And the activities are the actual activities that you do. The outputs are the products. And then finally, the outcome, which is really where a lot of people tend to focus on. But I would argue that you need to also focus on the activities as much as you focus on the outcomes. And we'll talk about that later. This is just a classic setup for a logic model. You have the resources represented here. What does the program need to accomplish its goals? So sometimes from an evaluation perspective, you can say, well, we don't have enough staffing, there isn't enough time, or there is enough time, we don't have enough resources, or there are resources available. So it gives you a sense of where things stand from a resource perspective. The activities are specifically, what is it that you're doing? And the way I usually like to do logic models is I like to start off with the outcomes, okay? I like to start off by, what do we hope to accomplish? And then have that listed. And then we go through every single one of those and say, what are we doing to achieve that outcome? So there's now a direct link between the outcomes as suggested, as the goals that are associated with it, and then the actual activities that will lead to that specific outcome. And this is kind of an iterative process. And I do want to note one thing, that logic models are meant to be living documents. They are revisited. They're not static. They shouldn't go back on the shelf after they're done. They're meant to be something that's used for strategic planning, for reflection, for communication. I have found that logic models, at least the process of it, helps to ensure that there's as much that there's a common vision around what's happening. I don't know if you've been in situations where you're in a group in your organization or with other organizations, and one person says, here's what we're doing and here's why we're doing it. And another person says, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. And then they're not really aligned. There really isn't a common understanding about the relationship between the activities and the outcomes. Well, a logic model helps to ensure that. Unfortunately, it's been used primarily as a way to for reporting and things like that, and not really leveraged for its actual true purpose, which is to really provide clarity, direction, vision around what the programs are meant to do and how they hope to accomplish that as part of this process. Okay, let's see here. Yes, you will get the PowerPoint as part of it. So I just saw the chat thing. Okay, so a couple of things around logic models, and then I'll move on to the other steps. So process versus outcomes. Again, I've done hundreds of logic models, and one of the big suggestions that I have is you really want to make sure that every single outcome is linked to an activity. The reason why this is important is because what you're gonna sometimes find out is you may have a lot of outcomes or goals listed, and there really isn't an activity that supports that specific goal. So that gives you at least a potential insight around either, is this goal important? Should we keep it? Or is it so important that we really need to focus an outcome on? So it provides a degree of clarity around what strategic decisions should be made regarding the program itself. The other thing I'd like to also point out is that there are different outcome categories. And the way that you frame them is also critical. And usually an outcome is an increase in something, a decrease in something, a change in behavior, whether it's in a positive direction or a negative direction. So you want to, for example, you want to use active language when creating this. So you want to increase pro-social behavior. You want to decrease drug dependency, decrease homelessness, and so on and so forth. So the language you use should be active, especially when creating these different elements associated with it. But the big thing here is you want to be able to use the logic model to really clarify what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you hope to accomplish those different goals. I know a big part of it is we may have these ideas around goals. And I know everyone wants goals, wants outcomes, wants everything to be kind of listed that way. And I just have a few tips on how to actually write out these goals. One of the biggest tips is, can it be somehow captured, measured in some way, shape, or form? The common question that I always ask when I'm starting a logic model process is, what are you trying to achieve? And then if you're successful, what will be different? How do you know that you're on the right track as part of it? And answering those questions from either your own observations, from what you've seen, from what you've heard from others is really helpful to clarify the goals. So if we say, for example, we want to create a classroom community. Well, how do you know that the classroom community has been created? So for example, I ask the question, well, what does that look like in a classroom? And I get responses like, oh, we'll see a lot of discussion in the classroom. We'll see students helping other students that are struggling. We'll see, you see, that's how you kind of begin the process of defining these goals and I'll use the word concrete terms, because that in essence, what you're potentially trying to impact and change, it's not always captured quantitatively, meaning surveys and observations. It can be captured qualitatively, but we have to know what to look for too as part of that process and make sure that there's an alignment between what you're seeing and what our understanding is. This is me speaking as an evaluator. And so that's just something to kind of think about as you are considering what the goals are. And then finally, kind of just last tips, the goals, because I know there's a lot of focus on it. I mean, the title of this is impacts. of this presentation. The whole idea is that they really should be something that that are as clear as possible, that provide as much insights as possible about what it is that you're trying to accomplish and what can be observed as part of the process. And typically, when I'm writing outcomes and when I'm writing goals, I try and make each one separate. So in the logic model, for example, I'll say, here's a specific outcome, and I don't combine outcomes together. I don't say we're going to increase classroom community and grades. Those are two separate things. And then each one should lead to a specific activity that's associated with it. And this is just basically a summary of why logic models should be used. It helps make assumptions explicit. I think that's the biggest advantage of it. Especially if you're in a program where the original leadership, the original inspiration has shifted or changed, it's really nice to go through a logic modeling process to ensure that whoever comes in as the new leader has kind of an explicit understanding of what's happening. It really makes these assumptions really, really explicit. It can also help other programs understand what you're doing. And it can also help communicate what you're doing to outside audiences, whether it's funders or the public in general. So that's the step that's associated frequently with how you describe a program as part of the evaluation process. The next part is you focusing the evaluation design. Now, you use the logic model to understand what the program looks like. So here are the activities and here are the outcomes. And then within the evaluation, you don't have to look at everything. And the focusing of the design is you basically want to know where are the most potentially important questions that we have that would be potentially the most useful, the most interesting, the most relevant for us to answer. That's where the focusing the evaluation design comes in. No evaluation can answer every single question. And so my big recommendation is always to prioritize. And this is where the focusing the evaluation design is. Now, at this stage, you can answer several questions. These are the typical, these capture 95% of the questions that I tend to answer in my own work, okay? How's the program being implemented? What are the program outcomes? And I have this arrow here to denote one thing, which is that some questions are easier to answer than others, okay? Not all questions are equally accessible or as easy to answer by across the board. So the easiest question to answer is the program doing what it's supposed to be doing? So is it providing hot meals? Is it recruiting students? Is it offering the services as described? Okay, these are process questions. And first of all, I'm not saying that it's logistically easy to collect this data, but generally speaking, it's easier to answer this question, okay? And the reason why I like to bring it up is because it's really important to look at the process. When you're looking at an evaluation, when you're looking at a program, you have to know, are things being implemented as planned? Because if we're looking down the line at outcomes, we have to understand why we got the outcomes that we did. And I'll give a pessimistic example. So let's just say a program's outcomes are not being achieved. We need to look at the process because we need to know, are the outcomes not being achieved because it's not being implemented well? Or are the outcomes not being achieved because there's some issue with the way the program is designed, okay? Those are two different answers or reasons for why the outcomes aren't being achieved. And they lead you as the decision makers to two different responses. If it's not being implemented well, then it's an easy fix. You implement it better, or you put in strategies, or you revise logic model so it's more feasible to implement, and then there's a high likelihood that it'll lead to your outcome. If it's being implemented well, but you're still not achieving your outcomes, then it requires a more deeper reflection about why that's happening. Is it the actual theory behind it, the idea behind it, or why it's occurring? And those are two different decisions from a programmatic standpoint. So, but it's relatively easy to collect this data. And I want to say I respect the time and energy it does take to do it. I'm just saying relatively easy, okay? Because the remaining questions get a little bit harder to actually answer, but they're still worthwhile. The program outcome question is basically you are looking at whether or not the expected change that you're targeting is actually happening. So I do a lot of educational evaluation, and within that, I look at, dropout rates. I look at GPA. I look at A through G preparedness. I look at a lot of these different outcomes. Okay, and then so we have a program or a policy that's being implemented, and then we're looking at the change in these outcomes, and I see, okay, are there changes in the trends? Again, this is a little bit harder because it requires more outcome data, potentially more surveys, even interviews, conversations, and so on and so forth as part of it. But now I can answer that question. Okay, so things are changing in this particular area around this particular domain. Okay, so that's a somewhat of an easy question to answer, relatively speaking. A harder question is, are these outcomes changing because of my program? Okay, now I'm going to take a second, reflect on that. This question is basically answering, are the outcomes changing generally? Like are things changing? And this one is answering, are these outcomes changing because of my program? Okay. Do you see the difference between those two questions? And you, from an evaluation perspective, you have to kind of be aware of which one are you answering, because this one technically is a harder question to answer than this one. This one basically requires more tracking of the outcomes to monitor what's happening, but there could be a lot of reasons for why that change is occurring. The third one here, it could be that you need to set up a different structure to really understand the link between what the program is doing and what the outcome is occurring. The reason why I bring it up is because sometimes when you're doing evaluation, it's okay to start here. It's okay to start with program process and program outcomes, just to give you a sense of what's happening, how things are being implemented. I would caution you, without a lot of like feasibility studies and so on and so forth, to commit yourself to answering this question. That's a lot harder question to answer, a lot harder. And then even more harder, I don't even know if that's a correct sentence. Hardest, even more challenging is when you start to break down the specific program activities and see which one is having the effect, the outcome that you're connected with. The reason why I bring up these questions is because as a not-for-profit, as an organization, I understand that you're asked to answer a lot of evaluation questions. I just want you to be aware of kind of the difficulty associated with each question and what you're potentially committing yourself to. This is a really important question. I'm not dismissing this question. I'm just saying that you kind of have to work up to it. You have to have like good infrastructure, good everything to get to this question. And if you are, so I wouldn't skip these and go directly to this one. I would say build up to this one, build up to the third question. Okay. I rarely ever do this question because I find it almost impossible from a feasibility standpoint to do so, because it's hard to break down the specific program components and link them to outcomes. But that's just something that I don't necessarily recommend as an evaluator. And then the last one is, how did this program achieve its results? It's not that now we see these results and now we see these outcomes. The question that you want answered is, well, why did it work? What made it work? That is a really hard question to answer, and it's primarily done through interviews, observations, a lot of qualitative work. It's a worthwhile question to ask, especially if something seems to be succeeding and having an impact. And it's definitely worth getting that deeper understanding. That requires a different set of tools and techniques that are associated with it. But and part of the reason for why you can answer this question is if you have a good logic model, it's based on experience, it's based on research, it's based on a lot of different elements that previous studies, that allows you to really dig deeper into understanding why. And an even more important question potentially is, can it be scaled up or expanded or implemented in other locations? So again, this is what I mean by focusing the evaluation, which is the evaluation is driven by the questions that you select. And the questions you select should be part of a broader conversation that happens when you're engaging the stakeholders as part of this process. And you'll see why I kind of go that route. Okay, great. So, of course, the big thing at the end is now you've selected your question, you've engaged the stakeholders, they're really interested in impact. You've described the program using the logic model, you focus the evaluation design, you're going to really look at outcomes more broadly, you're not looking at causal effects per se. Now comes the point where you are trying to gather credible evidence. I love this word, credible evidence. And because it's used a lot, right? Like I hear it all the time. And now I'll ask you rhetorically, well, what do you mean by credible? Like credible to whom? You know, like what does that actually look like? And this is why I think the engaging stakeholders is again, I go back to it. Part of credibility is understanding what are the information needs and what kind of information would help the stakeholders that you and by stakeholders, that could also mean yourselves. I'm not talking about necessarily an outside entity. Sometimes it can be, but sometimes it can be just you as an organization or you as an individual. Like asking yourself, what would you value as part of the evidence? And there's a lot of factors that come into establishing credibility. And I can go off on like a 3-hour tangent on the philosophy of credible evidence, but I'm not, okay? I'm gonna keep it as short and concise as possible. Now, believe it or not, the CDC itself, this is again, was published in the 90s, doesn't say credible evidence means randomized controlled trials. It doesn't say that credible evidence means only numbers. This is why I love this framework. The way they describe it is credible evidence means the best evidence that you can use to answer your questions, okay? So if you decide to do a purely numbers type study, then the standards used to understand those numbers, like the statistics and all that stuff, that if you do that well, then that becomes credible. If you decide to go more on the explanation and use more qualitative inquiry, interviews, observations, focus groups, then the standards used to kind of judge the quality of qualitative come into play. They're not saying only numbers count. They're not saying only interviews count. They're basically saying credibility is dependent on the methods that best answer your question, okay? And this is kind of a critical piece to this conversation, because oftentimes when we think credible, we're thinking large scale, highly quantitative studies. That's not necessarily the case. And there's that subtlety that's associated with it. But ultimately, there are some things that kind of help you determine credibility. The question or questions of interest. So if you select one of the questions, so if you're looking at, like, we're looking at processes, our question is, how well is this program being implemented? Then the most credible evidence for that is a tracking form of some kind, or tracking data around who's attended, how many times, how many services were provided, how many hours were done doing X, Y, and Z. Okay, if you're looking at outcomes, then credibility, then the credibility comes into, well, what do we mean by a specific outcome? Are we looking at outcomes from let's just say academic outcomes? So what counts as good academic outcomes? GPA, attendance, engagement in the classroom. So that determines credibility. If we're looking at things that are more like, let's just say, qualitatively measured, transformative experiences, changes in attitudes, and so on and so forth, where that's really only manifest potentially through interviews or focus groups, then that becomes credible evidence. So the question of interest is really at the heart of establishing credibility. The other piece is context. Does it make sense to kind of collect this information in this specific context that you're operating in? And ultimately, what are some of the things that you would look at? The context could also be determined by who the stakeholders are, and what they are expecting and looking for as credibility too. I've done some evals where I've had to collect evidence that I didn't necessarily view as credible, but the stakeholders I was working with, that's the only way they viewed things. And so it was something that I had to balance what I thought was right with what they thought was right in order to hopefully facilitate use down the line. And again, this is what the assumptions made by the evaluator and the stakeholders kind of comes in. Around, again, I can go into story mode, but I'm trying to keep it within the time limit. But ultimately, that's part of the process. Is you have to understand what is, if the end user or the stakeholder is going to be an outside entity, then also thinking about what they viewed as credible comes into the conversation. The approach used to guide the evaluation. I don't have a lot of time to talk about different approaches, but evaluators can actually act as social change agents. So within the evaluation, there's a lot of areas. There's transformative evaluators, there's empowerment evaluation, there's and then on the other end of the spectrum, there are evaluators that only want to do things like randomized control trials, which is, everything quantitative. You randomly assign people into treatment and control conditions, and you look at their impact. And then there's everything in between. There's culturally responsive evaluation, there's utilization-focused evaluation, there's so many different ways. And so depending on the approach that's adopted, that can also help you to determine whether the evidence is credible or not in the context that you're operating in. And then finally, the last thing is evaluation is a service-oriented endeavor, and it's constrained by time and resources, just like and staffing. And so if you are asked to look at an impact of a program on graduation rates, 4-year graduation rates, but the funding is only for 3 years. Think about that. And so, I don't know how many have been in that situation, but I sure have, and so I have only 3 years, and the outcome that everyone's interested in is 4-year graduation rates, and I only have 3 years to study the impact of the program. Then I can't do that for obvious reasons. I don't have the time, I don't have the money or the resources to actually do that. So I have to look backwards. So I have to take steps back to help establish, well, what are the indicators that someone will graduate in 4 years? So that becomes my credible evidence. And this is where the logic model comes in. So in order for someone to graduate in 4 years, they need to be completing their coursework on time, in a timely manner. They need to finish their prerequisites. They need to have a certain GPA. And if everything looks like they're moving in that direction, then I can basically make an argument that they're on the right trajectory to graduate within 4 years, barring any major changes or issues. And that becomes my credible evidence in that particular context. So that's how kind of the logistical time constraints come into play as part of this process. Okay. I just threw a lot at you, so I'm gonna, is it okay? I'll check the chat. And I know.
Yeah, Tarek, we had some that wanted to pose some questions, but
sure.
I don't know if you're ready for that to kind of begin our Q&A session.
You know what, I'm trying to think, I only have a few more slides, so maybe I kind of want to answer the questions, but I kind of want to, sorry, I'm wasting time. you know what, let me just go through this and then I'll answer questions. I think that's the most efficient. I apologize. I usually do stop, but I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure I'm respectful of everyone's effort. So
to get started Q&A session, folks, we're just going to use the raise hand functionality. But if you can't speak for whatever reason, we'll go ahead and just have you drop your questions in the chat and we'll monitor it.
That sounds great. Okay. And so the justifying conclusions is, again, as near, so you gathered the evidence and now you come up with a conclusion. Remember in the beginning of the session of the activity, I looked at everyone had different priorities and criteria around Zoom and so on and so forth. So you actually, just because you collected the evidence doesn't actually mean that you've come up with a conclusion. So you have to kind of summarize everything that's been collected and in essence, justify it. Like, why do you think this is good? Why do you think this is bad? Why do you think this is in the middle? And then what evidence can you bring to bear to justify the conclusions that you've come up with? This is why I always like to introduce the logic of eval, because it's a process of laying out everything. So here's what here are the criteria that's associated with our program. It aims to increase graduation rates. It's the standard of performance is we want to increase graduation rates by 10%. We start collecting data. We see that graduation rates have increased by 15%, which is great. And that leads to the conclusion that our program is really working if we're able to establish that causal link. So that's what I mean by justifying conclusions. The data, rarely does it speak for itself. It has to actually come together and you have to come up with a reasoning for why you concluded the things that you did. And then the last step, and this is why I love this model, is that it really emphasizes the fact that evaluation isn't for evaluation's sake, it's meant to be used, okay? There's a whole area in eval called utilization-focused eval, and it all focuses on how do you increase the chances of evaluations being used. It runs under the assumption that people, not organizations, use information. And at its core, it encourages you or the evaluator to think really carefully around who has a vested interest in the knowledge that's being gained or the data that's being collected, okay? And within this domain, they talk about this idea of someone who's a primary intended user, and these are like the characteristics of what to look for. They're individuals that are interested, knowledgeable, open, like they're willing to listen. They represent the stakeholder constituency. They're viewed as credible. They're willing to be kind of, collaborate, and they're available. And really thinking about who those individuals might be from the start of the evaluation process can really help facilitate use at the end, or actually throughout the evaluation process, not just at the end. And so I always really like to focus on this because, again, evaluation is not research. It uses a lot of tools from research, but it's not. It's meant to be a service. It's meant to be something that's useful as part of the process. And then the last slide is basically this whole thing is guided by these principles. It has to be useful. It has to be feasible. You have to act ethically. That's where propriety comes in. And you actually have to be somewhat accurate about this whole process as you engage in this whole thing, in this entire endeavor. And that's really these are the kind of what are called like the guiding principles for evaluators. And at every step, as you're engaging stakeholders, describing the program, focusing the design, you have to really follow these standards. Like what's useful, is this feasible? Am I acting ethically? And how accurate is the information I'm collecting? And then the last couple of points is, a formative evaluation. Basically, you go through this cycle basically not over and over again, but you do it over potentially multiple iterations, where you're using what you've learned and you're engaging stakeholders again and answering different questions, adjusting the program, and then using that whole process towards continued program development and improvement and learning. And then with a summative eval, the whole idea is it actually does stop. So, and the use comes in about decisions about, do we continue, working on this particular program or trying to address this particular problem, or do we move on to something else or different? And so that's kind of the big distinguishing factors that are associated with it. And then lastly, if you haven't had a chance, there's American Evaluation Association. They have a lot of resources on additional training, information, publications, and so on and so forth. There's a website that I also recommend. It's called Better Evaluation. It's really quite comprehensive on the different types of evals and approaches that you can use. And then finally, I put in the Kellogg Foundation Logic Model Guide. This is kind of the most commonly used guide for how to develop logic models. And it's something that I hope you'll find really helpful because it's kind of the standard way of doing it. There are a lot of other ways of doing it, and there are limitations associated with it, but this is the most commonly understood and accepted logic model guide out there. And with that, I have 18 minutes for questions. Okay, that sounds great. And I will share these slides right after this, okay? Cool. Is it okay if I stop sharing so I can see people? Because I prefer to do that. I can go back to the slides if need be, but. Okay, let's hear it.
So we did actually have a question a few moments ago. Tarek in the chat, if you want to scroll up to see, if you want to start with that.
We can go ahead and read that one out loud, Alana.
Yeah,
yeah. I'll just read it. One of the challenges I've experienced with evaluators in the past when measuring initiatives aimed at addressing complex social problems is that evaluators lean into what they can measure as opposed to what the goals of the efforts actually are. How do you avoid that?
That's a great question. I agree. Hi, Jared. I've worked with Jared before.
Unfortunately, Jared's not on with us anymore.
Oh, no.
But I did want to
that was 20 years ago. That was right after I finished. Okay. That is a great question. And I guess part of my job here is to try and help you push back if that's the case. I do think that sometimes getting clarity on what the I'll answer it. This is a really hard question, so I'm just gathering my thoughts on it. This is where feasibility and accuracy kind of come into conflict. Okay, complex social outcomes take a lot to measure and capture. They take time, they take energy, they take effort. Okay. They can potentially be captured in some way, shape, or form, but it takes a tremendous amount of investment. I apologize if I sound crass about it, but if the resources are not really available to do that, then it has to be scaled down to something that's manageable from an evaluation perspective. And I'm not sure what Jared's situation was, but that tends to be where the conflict lies. Sometimes if you're able to scale on the maybe one or two most critical aspects of it, then you can measure with some degree of accuracy given the constraints around the evaluation. If it's too broad and there's just too many elements, then the evaluator will tend to kind of rely on, if you measure a lot of different things, you can only measure them so accurately. If you focus on one or two things, then the accuracy increases, but the scope varies. So that's the negotiation that has to happen between the program and the evaluator on what they're going to focus on. So yes, that's a legitimate criticism, but that's also something that has to be discussed as part of the process. Okay. Other questions in the chat, or should I just take people's raised hands?
Let's go with the raised hands. Thanks for that.
Go ahead, Shakira. I just called on Shakira. Did she?
I'm muted, even with my camera off.
Okay. There we go.
Mute myself. All right. Hi, Tarek. Can you give some examples of intended users? And the reason why I asked that is because, for example, in this work, usually if you need a logic model or any sort of evaluation, there's a grant involved. So I have the intended user of the folks that will use the information, but really the audience are the reviewers of the grant application.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so I would say that you should have a logic model, even if you're not doing a grant application, because I do think that it provides a lot of clarity about what's happening. Now, the grant reviewers, I was thinking about intended users of evaluation findings. Okay, the grant reviewers don't necessarily look at the findings, do they? Like after it's
They
been
will,
reviewed.
yeah, because in this case, it's a research institution. And
Okay.
so they certainly want us to go to conferences and put on all our
Perfect.
flashy slide decks.
Okay, sounds good. Then in that case, then part of, at least for the purposes of the evaluation, is what I try and do is I try and leverage the resources to both answer their questions, but also insert questions that are relevant to me, to the organization itself. And so rather than go all the way in on everything that they want to see, I would actually try and balance it out and make you as the organization the intended user too, as part of that. You can have multiple intended users. Now, the potential limitation for you is they may want to only see quantitative data. Is that a correct assumption? Like they want to see like numbers and.
Fortunately, because of so much need and focus around DEIJA plus, this year there is wholehearted concern and need and priority around qualitative. So
That's beautiful.
Yes, exactly.
So that gives you a lot more flexibility. And when we're before, I think that sounds good. So in that particular case, when you have kind of, the thing is, what I mean by user, I mean people that will actually like take the information and change something about a program. So like a reviewer is a great user if you're thinking just, but their focus is so narrow on just funding or not funding, which is critical. I'm not dismissing it, but I would also build in information that you as the organization would find useful as part of that, and just balance out their needs with, but prioritize almost your needs. What I find in grant applications is they want to also see how you will use the information. It's not just that whether they're going to fund it or not, but how you've used what you've learned to continue developing the program. Okay, go ahead, Heather.
Hi, thank you. I'm thinking about accuracy of data, and you said a couple of really interesting things. One is evaluation is not research; it's supposed to be useful, which is I've always kind of thought of evaluation working at a bunch of nonprofits as it's not very accurate for most of the nonprofits that I've worked with, because it's so time consuming to get enough data. And I guess my question is, like, if there's an organization that serves 200 families in a year and the way they evaluate it is to ask the families how it impacted them with a survey, but they get 30 surveys back and all of them are just glowing and awesome, this is an amazing organization, how well can you trust that data? Because it's a self-selected group of people who are enthusiastic about what they've received. And I'm just wondering, how is any of this even accurate unless you do it more like research?
No, and that my full quote was, it leverages research techniques and tools.
Yeah.
So you still adhere to all the criteria that research has.
Yes.
So you wouldn't compromise on those elements. And so you would note the limitation. For example, in that particular case, you would note we can't, on the last step, justifying the conclusions, you wouldn't basically say this program works 100%. You would say, based on these results, it appears that the program may be doing amazing. However, here are potential issues with the data that we collected, and then you outline it. So the distinction I'm making is that you are using the same tools and techniques that are in research, and you're trying to adhere to the best possible on what's considered rigorous or not. In research, it's just the reason why you're doing it is different. It's guided by stakeholders. It's guided by use. It's got, you know what I mean? It's directed towards decision making. That research piece will, like the techniques, the methods, the analysis, you would still adhere to all like the criteria associated with what counts as rigorous within that domain. It's not that it would be more loose. So in that case, you would completely acknowledge that it appears, based on this data we collected, here are the results. However, be cautious about, and I've done this, interpreting these results. Are samples potentially biased? It's not really comprehensive enough. We need additional data collected to triangulate to see if there's other outcomes that are associated with that are showing that. So you would definitely not give it a wholehearted endorsement based on those results.
And then, so then that just makes me wonder, like, why do it? You know what I mean? Like, if the data is so limited, and I think for a lot of nonprofits, that's just true.
Yes.
Then we're frankly jumping through a hoop. And I would love to see more nonprofits be able to do better at getting more data. So
here's my suggestion, which is, remember when I said don't jump to number 3 in terms of the questions? Like, you have to, there's a thing called evaluation capacity building, ECB, okay? The idea is that you don't start at like perfection, you start somewhere. So it's amazing that even that there's like a survey out there that's being collected. And so, okay, this survey this year didn't really work out because our response bias decrease wasn't, number of respondents was low. So next year, we'll focus attention on potentially revising the survey to make sure it better reflects what happens, and then seeing what are strategies we can use to recruit more people to respond to the survey. So you see, it's not like I'm not, my suggestion is not to go from 0 to 60 all in 1 year. My suggestion is to build capacity slowly over time. That way and I've worked with organizations and I've seen it happen. I know it may not be perfect in the beginning, and that's okay. It's just that as long as you're trying to build capacity year after year, you'll reach that point. So that's my recommendation.
Super helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Okay.
All right. Yeah, I think, well, unless there are any other questions, Tarek, would you mind sharing, if I'm sure there might be folks that would like to, that'd be interested in following up with you. So we'll go ahead and share NPRN's like contact info as well, in case anyone has any other questions. Tarek, if you're willing to share yours, we'd love to share the participants here, and we'll be sure to send out the follow-up materials, the resources that were mentioned, as well as the slides from today's presentation and the recording. Oh, actually, it looks like we might have one more question. Go ahead. And I'm sorry, I forgot how to pronounce your name. I just know your last name's Coffee.
That's no problem. Thank you. Thank you. Tarek, I guess I just want to ask a kind of an open field question where myself and our organizations got a lot of that good narrative history where there's been a lot of lives we've impacted in positive ways. And we're growing, and this is a new area for someone like myself to get better in. And could you just throw out some general recommendations for someone who's maybe more of a storyteller to get involved in some of that data measurement?
Yeah, stories are great. First of all, I'm trained originally more in the numbers, quantitative stats, all that stuff. And throughout my career, I've migrated more in the middle, and I've become really enamored with using stories to help guide the evaluation and justify conclusions and all those things. So I just want to acknowledge that. So here's my big takeaway around that. So it builds on what I said earlier to Heather, which is start building slowly, like see where you could relatively easily collect some quantitative data. So who's attending, what are some characteristics, put it in an Excel sheet, just to kind of at least begin the process of understanding who's benefiting from these services, and then even connecting them to the stories in terms of here's what happened with them. So at least now you have, and I'm going to take a diversity, equity, inclusion perspective. So even if you collect information on their background characteristics, socioeconomic status, if you have it, and then write down notes or the stories about what happened with them, okay? You can now at least begin, if you have enough of them, begin to say, okay, here's what happened to individuals that were with us for a really long time. Here's what happened to first-time visitors. Here's what happened to individuals from low SES versus middle SES. Here's what happened across English and people that spoke English easily versus those that are, English as a second language. So you can even use the stories to see, okay, when a family comes in or when a group comes in or individual comes in and they have like these certain characteristics, here's typically what happens. Here's what's the stories that have emerged from their experiences. And you may be surprised to find that they may have different experiences. They may all be positive, but they may have different experiences based on these characteristics. So that's like an initial first step to like look at what's happening based on, who's coming in and who's utilizing your services. And that's a really quick way of at least beginning to gather and building that capacity for reflective. There's something called reflective practice. And it's really meant to not be, evaluation is not really, its goal isn't to intimidate, it's really meant for learning. At least that's the approach that I take. And it's extremely helpful. And I can give you a million examples of how we've leveraged it in the past. It doesn't work all the time, but when it does, it really makes a difference. So I'm just obviously I'm a big believer in it. That's what I do. It's like, yeah. So I hope that's helpful.
All right, well, I guess with that, we will go ahead and wrap here. So our contact information for NPRN is going to be found in the chat along with Tarek's email as well. And we'll be sure to send out a follow-up. I'm just going to go ahead and drop one other plug in the chat. We've got some additional NPRN programming coming up in the next few weeks here. Like we mentioned at the beginning, we have an ED roundtable this Thursday, a Grant Center Ask Me Anything webinar on Tuesday, October the 11th. And of course, Partnership for Excellence is on October 19th. Registration for 2 of those is already up, so go ahead and check those out. And we'll be sure to see you all soon for future programming. Thank you all for joining us today.
Sounds good. Thank you all. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Tarek.
Bye.
Here.
Thank you, folks. Have a good day.
Thank
you.
you.
You too.
Thank you, everyone.